wonderful introduction, and to my students for that wonderful introduction to my introduction. It is an honor, a privilege, and I hope it will be much fun to be with you this morning. And I again want to express gratitude to Luigi and the entire Cortona family and staff. Am I too close, too loud? It should be louder. Right.
That's great.
So the speaker, this is this funny room. The loudspeakers are not here. They're back there. So can you hear me now, Brother Dave?
Yes.
Good. All right. So today I want to share with you some reflections on perhaps where our field is going, that were directions completely outside our conception of where we might be in 2019. And I'm going to spend the first part of the talk reflecting on the theme of being human in a technological world, perhaps twisting it a bit to say being a meditator in a technological world, or becoming a practitioner or meditator in a technological world via technology. So this original artwork by the daughter of one of the participants in the Shamatha project is not so very far off from, while it's a caricature of trying to measure what's going on in the brain of a meditator, and this is the idealized version of myself here. Correct body image. It is kind of sometimes the case that scientists think they can get to the essence of experience through their measurements and come up with a complete understanding that actually always in practice eludes us. Just to let you know how identified I have been at various points in my life with brainwaves, here is a picture of Richie Davidson on the left and me on the right wearing electrode caps. And I showed this picture to the Dalai Lama in 1990, and I said, we call this picture Hasidic aliens. And he looked at me like, what are you talking about? And I said, Jews from outer space. And then he completely cracked up. So, why I show this is not just for a laugh line, but it's because in our minds, there was a kind of implicit Rosetta Stone in these very tiny signals that we might record that motivated our careers in strong ways. So there's a concept called the social imaginary, and this has been put forward by the philosopher Charles Taylor. And in many of the talks today, in this week, we have been hearing about different kinds of social imaginaries. Karam's talk was about the social imaginary of economics that was so debilitating till he reimagined what it could be. So Charles Taylor says, by social imaginary, I'm thinking of the ways people imagine their social existence, how they fit together with others, how things go on between them and their fellows, the expectations that are normally met, and the deeper normative notions and images that underlie these expectations. This construct, I think, in light of the kind of interconnectivity that is a reality of people in relationship that Brother David so eloquently spoke of on the first day, means that our worldviews are constantly being shaped by those around us. The religious studies scholar, Buddhist scholar David McMahon has elaborated on the construct of social imaginary, going from beliefs all the way to cosmology, including, very importantly, those beliefs that are embodied in large-scale social institutions like education systems, religious institutions, governmental institutions, public policy. What goes for okay in a given society or cultural environment? So we have this world of science looking at this world of the meditator in the context of the research we have done. And these social imaginaries can be in tension. So one of the things that is now an occurrence in the world, often in articles in the press, is that science has proven the benefits of meditation. And now science becomes the validation for this deeply human, individual, ineffable activity that is part of our birthright to explore our own minds. But it needs to be legitimated, so people think, by science. So we've now interposed the scrim, the sort of translucent, imperfect, partial view of what we can measure in science as something that is used to legitimate a set of practices that are probably as old as the species. The simple contemplation of what is. So David McMahon says, the scientific study of contemplative practice neglects the role of context, of culture, history, social interaction, political, religious, and ethics. So no matter what we measure, brainwaves don't give us, oh, and this part is the ethics, and this part is the technique. You know, we don't have a statistical way to parcel out what contributes to the commitment to look at your mind and what you hope to find. When we isolate these practices from their context for the sake of study, as we do in many laboratory environments, and often we do in many trainings, we inevitably distort how they actually work in people's lives. And I'm not just speaking about traditional or religious contexts. I'm speaking about, when people have an app for a calming, they turn on a calming app. They do it in a circumstance. They do it when they might feel anxious. They do it perhaps in a social situation while other people are discussing something that they feel excluded from. There are new contexts that we do not know about that have evolved. And there are many contexts we do know about that we typically ignore in research. We can't make sense of contemplative practice in isolation from these contexts. They're inextricably interwoven with them. It's not that you just, flex your body when you go to a yoga class. They're part of a particular Lebensfeld, a life world. So, if you think of the term life world, and you then think about what science might be able to measure, you have a big explanatory gap. David said this in the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute 3 years ago. So I showed this picture last year. Here is Renuka in 1992. Yeah? And there is Francisco Varela. There's Charles Taylor, there's Alan Wallace, a number of other luminaries. Here's Thupten Jinpa when he was still in robes, Joan Halifax, Adam Engel, the president of Mind and Life at the time. So we're kind of doing a brainwave demo for the Dalai Lama. And he's really interested. He's like very geeky. And you wouldn't think the Dalai Lama is particularly geeky, but here, Francisco is showing him the EEG trace, and what does the Dalai Lama say? He says, how do you measure the time it takes for the wave to go across the screen so you can measure its frequency? This is what the Dalai Lama says. He wants to know about the horizontal time base. We had a very different experience when we went to present an EEG demo at the Institute of Buddhist Dialectics. They're not so geeky in the terms of brainwaves. And they're looking at us and laughing because here's Francisco with something funny on his head when the mind is here. Like, what are these guys up to? Now, I used to just talk about this as differences of social imaginaries that in here, that are sort of going to be that way across time. But this photo from 1992 is a moment in history and may actually no longer be an accurate representation of the way monks in training in the Tibetan tradition think. Because now bring us to 2018, and we have the Drepung Losling Center for Science and Meditation. This is a recent institution, and Bruce here can tell us much, much more about, there he is in the back, who is Bryce, right? Who's been involved for many years in the process of educating monks about science and many other topics. So from the website of this science center, the Drepung Losing Center for Science and Meditation is the response to both His Holiness the Dalai Lama's vision for continued collaboration at the intersection of science and Buddhism, and to the mission of promoting well-being through training in ancient wisdom practices. And here, these are my italics. As the burgeoning field of contemplative science provides evidence about the benefits of meditation, interest in the practice of meditation is slowly growing around the world. This is a certain kind of remarkable loop where the Dalai Lama's interest in science, scientists who have been touched by Buddhist practice, talking about neuroscience to the Dalai Lama, research efforts like Tanya has done and many others, our group, Richie Davidson, many people around the world, Tish, and we'll talk to you about in threads of how this work filters into the education world. There's a movement now back from traditional training into the world of scientists who then want to carry it into their craft to honor its impact on their lives, contribute to a thing called validation, which I think is quite complex and questionable in terms of why we need to do this. The scientists who began this work did not need data from other scientists to say this techniques made sense. They made sense directly through the teacher's articulation of what it might mean to look at your mind. Now we're at a moment where we must show the evidence with tools that were never designed to actually bring clearly forward what it looks like scientifically to look at your mind. This is not classical, the evolution of psychological science was not focused on this question of the growth of wisdom and compassion. It just was about pathology and things that were pretty much drier than what we feel when we're impacted. So this is a fascinating moment. I just want to tag that now we have a monastic situation that has on the web an identity function that has been created by Western scientists in dialogue with the Dalai Lama. So here is a translation team led by Geshe Lakdor, who is head of the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, translating textbooks of some science for the consumption of monks in the monastery. One would ask, whether they will be translating this paper, Mind the Hype. It's a critical evaluation of the status of the evidence. The evidence is much weaker than the world believes. It's more variable. The effect sizes are weaker. And many other things other than Buddhist meditation are ameliorative. It's not the only path to well-being. So we'll see if this makes it to the monks. But here we are in a room with monks learning about the anatomy of the brain. And this is a still shot from a lecturer talking about a synapses. So if we were to show that same EEG demo now or in a couple of years, perhaps instead of laughing, and if they had seen 16 electrodes, they would have said, you have such poor coverage of the head, instead of the mind is here. So I just want to note these cultural shifts and forces and the stream of influences that are moving around. I was recently contacted by an entrepreneur outside of Delhi wanting the prescription for the right proven meditation that tech workers could go into in a kind of yoga studio and meditate their daily stress away for about 4 hours so they could go back to work. And I said, maybe you should talk to your grandparents, not to me. The irony is remarkable. So, with respect to this effort of science looking at meditation, every year it's unbelievable. There's this exponential rise. Now, every year I keep saying, well, it can't just keep going up. But I don't know. But this kind of a pattern often signifies a bubble. We don't know how long the bubble will last. But it won't be that, at some point you can't walk in the room because there are too many papers about mindfulness. But it is a remarkable fact that there is, in 1992, when we were doing this work in India, this was seen as career suicide. And now it's a career path. So it's not just a career path, it is pervasive in technology. If any of you have an iPhone, you have an icon that tells you about your health, which gives you your steps, and if you have a Fitbit and link it, you can get your heart rate patterns. So the current version after iOS 10, and now this is on 1.5 billion iPhones, there's a mindfulness quadrant. And on the mindfulness quadrant, of course, mine says no recorded data. You click on the mindfulness and it gives you a nice little video that links mindfulness with cappuccino. But it also gives you a long string of apps that are all in business relationships with Apple. Right? This is just a moment. This is current what I get on my iPhone. It used to just be Headspace, and then it was Calm, and then it was 10% happier. So this is a new context. Yeah? Now this is something that is remarkable. Again, this is a company called Buddhify. Yeah? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Somebody did, and it's making money on it. But I mean, I'm not. This could be like a caricature, right? Imagine someday there's going to be an app called Buddhify. Beautify with Buddhify. So, transmission, a term for those of you familiar with Tibetan Buddhism and other traditions, is about as sacred an articulation of a contact between a teacher and a student as exists in the world. Transmission has been turned into karaoke. So here's how it works. You put your thumbs from each hand on the bottom of your iPhone, and as long as you're pressing your two thumbs there, words that you should read appear on the phone that are meditation instructions, so that you become the meditation teacher. And because you may not embody what it might be to present a meditative technique, the pauses are built into the script. So if it says breathe, then it doesn't move on till it allows the other person to breathe. It doesn't even give you the choice of like, oh, well here, deliver this as you wish. It is like karaoke, that the words are bouncing with the dot, with the rhythm of the prescribed internal experience that they want this person to have. So this person is thinking I'm not saying that this is totally devoid of some remarkable, possibly wonderful things that are training the person delivering the instructions with a trace of like what it might be to slow down and to actually communicate directly with a friend. That is actually part of what's happening here. But the comparison of that with what it might be to receive teachings from a deeply informed, interactive teacher who can query you, who you can query, that's another gap of many orders of magnitude. So there is an idea that in contemplating this Buddhify moment arose in my memory from my youth. And that is this idea from Marshall McLuhan and Quentin Fiore. The medium is the message. Is actually, they say the medium is the massage. And they use massage on purpose because the medium massages our minds in ways that we can't predict and don't know what to expect. And so I'm going to play for you a short clip from a movie from 50 years ago. Is it what?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't.
I saw this?
Yeah, this is very easy.
Oh, okay. I was just like, get louder, or is this okay?
No, it's okay.
Oh, that's sorry. Illusory correlation. So here's a movie fragment, and let me know if you can understand it. And you'll be hearing Marshall McLuhan talk about the meaning of the title of this. The medium is the massage.
Well, the title, The Medium is the Massage, is teasing a way of getting attention. There's a wonderful sign hanging on a Toronto junkyard which reads, "Help beautify junkyards. Throw something lovely away today." And this is a very effective way of getting people to notice a lot of things. And so the title is intended to draw attention to the fact that a medium is not something neutral. It does something to people. It takes hold of them, it rubs them up, it massages them, it bumps them around, and as it were, chiropractically. And the general roughing up that any society gets from a medium, especially a new medium, is what is intended to be indicated in that title.
The medium of our time, electric technology, everything from the light bulb, the telephone, to the computer, to jets, and nuclear energy, is changing everything. We are in the middle of a tremendous clash between the old
they think of the old medium because the old medium is almost the content of the new medium, as movies tend to be the content of TV, and as books used to be the content, novels used to be the content of movies. And so every time a new medium arrives, the old medium is the content, and it is highly observable, highly noticeable, but the real wrapping up and massaging is done by the new medium, and it is ignored.
Yeah, 50 years ago. Have relevance, resonance to what it is to receive transmission through an app. The new medium has unintended, unknown consequences that then work because of the normativity associated with our devices. So now we look at this one. So this is a device that measures brain waves with wonderful small sensors that go on your forehead. A lot of what it measures is muscle tension here. They now have a new device, which is a pair of sunglasses. The company that makes Carrera brand sunglasses has partnered with them, and so they now have electrodes in the earpiece and nose bridge. And this is an app where they ask you to think about something, and they measure your brain electrical activity, and they use that as a pattern of mind wandering. And then when you sit and meditate, every time the computer in the device detects, and your iPhone detects that you resemble the pattern that you had when you were thinking, it's basically going to tell you, your mind is wandering. And the way it tells you is that sounds like the ocean in the distance, all of a sudden your mind begins to wander, so it thinks, and then the waves start crashing, which is of course just what you want to hear to bring your mind back to a calm place. If they've taken it out of the program, but last year or 2 years ago, if it detected your mind was not wandering for long enough, you began to hear beautiful birds. And then you would get a bird count at the end of your session so that you could actually compete with each other. How many birds did you get? Birds. A bird goes tweet tweet in your earphones to tell you you're meditating correctly. Now, aside from the fact that neuroscientifically you cannot do this with this kind of a device, and that everybody who tries it figures that out, the marketing is such, the rationalization is that there are people alive now who, if you can't give them a number that tells them how many steps they walked, what their resting heart rate is, how many birds they got or whatever, the self-monitoring movement, their existence is delegitimated. So they are now addressing the need of the population to get a false signal. So they have the illusion. This is kind of like attributing, in yesterday's talk, attributing agency to the robot, the authentic emotion to the robot. If you think about training your mind and understanding and gaining insight into the phenomena as they arise within you, there's something deeply disturbing about an external device telling you, because what I think this is doing is it's training you not to listen to yourself. And that is a problem. Now I've talked, when I first met the CEO of this company, this product should exist. And he got sufficiently angry, he told the science officer of the company, "Get him out of here." Because it was some kind of existential threat. 4 hours later, after dinner, he invited me to the company in Toronto. And all of the company staff, the engineers, they agree with me. The monetization of the company depends on the marketing. Believe it or not, there's a root inside this company that I think is really wonderful and pro-social, and that is that those sunglasses are going to be used by truck drivers and other drivers to tell if they're beginning to fall asleep. And his ethical issue wasn't my ethical issue, it was that the accelerometer in the headset is going to detect early cases of Parkinson's disease, because there'll be head tremor in a certain proportion of the population who is not yet diagnosed. That's what he was thinking about. So it's not black and white, but it's definitely a challenge. Another challenge is to think that these devices really can get at the experience of advanced meditators. So this is actually from an article in a newspaper in Canada where there was a project that was trying to look at the brain activity of monks, and hey, guilty as charged many years ago. We know a little better now. And so with this kind of device, there's an attempt to actually represent the effort as getting inside the mind. So when this goes out as a message in the press, what our craft is as neuroscientists gets submerged in claims that are of a whole other order than we would ever make. There's a very important article that was published just last week. This is Friday, June 14th, 2019, in The Guardian. This article by Ron Purser says that what has happened with the monetization of mindfulness trainings and apps is that these teachings have been subjected to the forces of the market. And so the ideas within them that moved us most, the radical ideas of the constructed nature of our lives, the importance fundamentally of ethics and compassion, our interdependence, this is getting systematically stripped out and in its place replaced with stress reduction, better productivity, good things for companies, for the HR department, and a promise of a fix for conditions in your life. And anything like the stress that you experience because of systemic oppression, so that your stress is actually the lawful response to an unjust circumstance, now that is implicitly removed. And so the attention only on the individual and not on anything structural in society is detuned, is taken away. And so the thesis in this article is that the mindfulness movement, certain aspects of it, have been co-opted by the neoliberal capitalist agenda of individual productivity and material values. It's a long article. It's a bit what we call snarky. But it makes a point that there is a point about. So on the other end, in my remaining time, I'm going to touch on this large project that I and my colleagues, Quinn and Aaliyah over there, and many others have been involved with for since 2003 is when we began thinking about it. 2007, 6, and 7 when we began to implement it. The artist collective is not wrong, and the other phrase would be slow science. We've heard about slow medicine. We've been practicing slow science, not always to our advantage. So for those of you interested in the state of the art of the field of research on meditation and mindfulness, I want to direct your attention to a remarkably comprehensive 59-paper special issue of the journal Current Opinion in Psychology. Each of these articles are easily digestible. They're 2,000 words. They're review papers. Quinn has an article. Tanya has an article. This is another article from our lab by Brandon King about why it might be important to move, instead of looking at the effects of apps on behavior, look at something much more intensive, residential retreats. And that's what we have done. So before I get to the retreat, I want to tell you a little bit more about me. How did I get to be doing this stuff? This is me at age 10. This spindly little guy. This is a friend same age. This is a very often sick child who had very severe asthma. And this is not a body that is thriving. So I would often, at summer camp, because of the mold in the cabins, I would immediately get sick. And so my first meditation retreats took place in the infirmary up here. I didn't know they were meditation retreats, but if you're asthmatic, you pay attention to your breath. And when you can breathe, you just watch your breath and you are grateful to be alive. I didn't realize that I was now paying for the privilege of recreating my childhood convalescence until I went to the Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts, and sitting in this room in July, not far from my summer camp, I heard a bee buzzing outside, and I said, hey, here I am, sitting by the window, watching my breath, grateful to be alive. So this is a thread that, is sort of long enduring. So in 1992, we had an opportunity to go to speak directly to His Holiness the Dalai Lama as part of the Mind and Life meetings. And this was where I met Alan Wallace, and he had the idea of investigating with science, which had a fair amount of tools for looking at attention. And he had a teacher, Genlam Rinpa, who taught that shamatha, meditative quiescence, focus stabilizing meditation. And with Genlam Rinpa, Alan had led a year-long meditation retreat in about 1988, 87, something like that. So Genlam Rinpa said, we wanted to bring monks to the lab that we had brought, the equipment that was alluded to. We brought all this equipment. We built a lab at the base of this mountain, Baksu Mountain, where these monks were living. And he said, oh no, don't ask them to come to you. you go to them. So we brought all this stuff, but it was sitting in a room, and we could take what we could bring on a backpack. And we went on these goat trails to little stone huts. And so this is the local population. And here's Alan, and Geshe Topten, who is one of the main Tibetan teachers in Italy. And he's doing a selective attention task on a laptop. And we also showed movies to monks that were difficult to watch. This is our large screen and our very high resolution Hi8 camera. But we were really impacted by a conversation with Geshe Topki. We asked him the difference between sadness and compassion. And he said, fair question. Sadness and compassion are separate mind streams. Sadness might be the occasion of catalyzing compassion. What he said was that compassion consists of two simultaneous things that have to be operating. You have to find the suffering of another unbearable while simultaneously loving the conditions that give rise to that suffering as a mother loves her child, so that you begin to penetrate into the causes and conditions of that suffering. So you have a chance of knowing how to be of benefit. Because the surface suffering may look very different than the underlying causes. And so in order to not just, make you feel better because of empathic distress, which Tanya will talk about, I think. This conversation was life-changing, and I'm still talking about it almost 30 years later. That experience and the experience of others in our group has led to a central question, which I will get to in a moment. So to talk about our project, in 2007, Alan Wallace taught 2 3-month meditation retreats. Alan is a Buddhist scholar, translator, teacher, practitioner. Some of his students are with us in the room. So we had full-time 3-month meditation retreats, about 6 hours a day of meditation, 2 groups of 30 people each, and they were a broad age range, 20 to 70. Now how do you do this? We randomly assigned people to one of 2 3-month retreats, and the other folks became a control group. Because if you're going to do a 3-month retreat, this is a self-selected group. It's like almost nobody does 3-month retreats. You can't do a 3-month retreat if you haven't done prior retreats. So it's very self-selected. So a control group cannot be just an age-matched group. They have to be people also interested and committed to the practice, but they're just not in full-time training. It's like if you're all musicians and you go to a summer music festival and you're playing chamber music all day, the way you will play at the end of the summer will be different than the other group of musicians who were not in that summer camp. The primary emphasis of training was on the cultivation of relaxation, stability of attention, perceptual clarity, and mindfulness of breathing. In addition, key attitudes, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity were cultivated. What's the motivating question that links back to Geshe Topki? How can we engage with and compassionately respond to our own suffering and the suffering of the world as it comes to us? And it comes to us. In fact, it's overwhelming us. And we've heard about the constant flood of a world in crisis with very discouraging trajectory lines. And yet we have to help the world by not being flattened by those trajectory lines. So we had 2 3-month retreats. And the people who we flew to the retreat center in 2007 from the second retreat, they were the control group for the first retreat, and then they had their own retreat later. And then we follow them up at 5 months, 15 months, and 6 to 7 years. It's a lot of follow-up. This is a remarkable team. I point out Quinn and Aaliyah, who are over there. And I'm sort of a conductor of a strange assemblage. It's not quite coordinated like an orchestra, so I don't know what to call it, but it is a remarkable collective of expertise and heart. And this has not been cheap. We've had many funders. And so in Colorado at Red Feather Lakes, northwest of Fort Collins, Colorado, in the Rockies, we had a meditation center, a lodge that had just been constructed. There's Alan teaching in the second retreat, and downstairs we built a laboratory, so now we have much better EEG coverage, 88 channels of brain activity. We can see participants on an unobtrusive video camera. And we have contextual effects. So it might be one thing to meditate in your bedroom of your apartment with an app going in your ears. It's a different thing to meditate in a 108-foot high stupa in front of a Buddha with the relics of the Tibetan monk Chogyam Trungpa's skull in the back of the Buddha. Those of you who are architects know about sort of the psychological consequences of different qualities of design. And every one of you, say in the temple just the other night, the architecture makes you feel so different. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about data, a little data. And I'm going to, in the remaining few minutes of this first hour of the morning, touch on experimental approaches that we can use to suggest a shift in the motivational salience of suffering, how the suffering of others becomes more important to us through this kind of training. So on the basis of the training intent, we expect decreased what we call rejection emotion. So if I show you a movie of someone who is injured with graphic injury, the first response might be to be disgusted, to find that disgusting, or you defend against it. Or you might think about perpetrators with contempt and anger. And so you might have this overall defensive, rejecting reaction to encountering the conditions of suffering, including in response to the victim. We expect, because of the vulnerability cultivated by the practice of meditation in the retreat context and the cultivation of this empathy and empathic resonance, compassion and loving kindness, that your emotional response below that rejection might come to the fore. You might feel more sad. You might feel the sadness of the situation. Sadness, yeah. How can we approach this experimentally? So what we did is we showed a movie, and we looked at facial expressions of emotion, and we published this. This is a paper by Erica Rosenberg, Tony Zanesco, a recent graduate from the laboratory and still a collaborator, and Brandon King, who is soon to graduate, whose work I'll talk about in a moment, and a host of others. I'm going to show you some graphic images. I'm not showing you the movie. This is a clip, these are stills from a movie called Fahrenheit 9/11 by Michael Moore, which was a documentary about the US-Iraq war. So here is a father holding a seriously wounded child, and you see this woman who has given permission for us to show her face, showing sadness. a woman victim of something like napalm. A soldier expressing remorse that war is not like a video game. We then, Tony and Brandon and Erica, Talmudically coded each one of the 46 muscle groups of the face, its position and intensity of contraction, and when contraction began. Every single frame of video for 60 people by hand. It takes about 150 minutes to code 1 minute of video. So these are data from 10 seconds of someone showing grief. And then this is how to get a spatiotemporal database of muscle expressions that then can be applied to an emotion dictionary so that the normative recognized facial expression of a given emotion would be assigned by the combination of muscle contractions. This is developed by Paul Ekman and Wally Friesen, called the Facial Action Coding System. Any of you with an iPhone X, when you can do the face recognition, one of the main groups that was computerizing facial action coding system was bought by Apple and developed the technology that does your face unlocking of the iPhone. So what do we find? We find, in comparison of the control group and the retreat group, these graphs are showing you, in terms of sadness, facial expressions, that at the beginning, pre-assessment, that's the beginning of the retreat, the groups do not differ. This is the probability of showing an expression of sadness, and the white line is the control group, and the darker bar is the retreat group. There's no difference between them, and there's also no difference in the average number of sadness expressions. After the training, there is a higher probability of the control group showing, let's see, let me just make sure I got this right. So the training group has a lower probability of no expressions and a higher number of expressions. These are, I'm sorry, I'm not getting this right. Let me say that again. The significant finding in these data is that after the meditation training, the meditation group has a lower probability of not showing sadness. That means there's a higher probability of showing sadness, but if they show sadness, they show the same number of facial expressions. What about these rejection emotions? While it looks like there's a difference between the groups beforehand, this is not significant because this is a kind of expanded scale. There's no difference in the probability or the number of expressions. After the training, there's no difference in the probability of the retreat group showing anger, contempt, or disgust. What there is a significantly lower number of those expressions. One of the interesting things to think about is if you're paying close attention to your emotions as they arise, and you have a moment when you might feel a flash of anger or contempt, or a flash of disgust, you then can interpret that emotion and reappraise the situation, and then think about, oh, it's different than my first thought. There's more space to actually use your initial emotional reactions to educate yourself to be most skillful in the circumstance. And this is incredibly important in conflict resolution, because you might immediately find, oh, I don't agree. And then the solidity in you about that disagreement is perceived, and then perhaps you relax because, well, before the disagreement you were both in the world. After the disagreement you're both in the world. So maybe we can share our worlds and understand each other better, then solidify into that rejection stance. We showed people after the movies a storyboard of the whole scenes of the clip, and we asked them to rate how they felt at different frames every 2 seconds. And it turns out that when you look at self-reports across the film, after the retreat, trainees' sadness expressions, they related not to sadness. They didn't report they were feeling sad when we were thinking they looked sad. They reported they were feeling sympathy. Sympathy is more other-directed, empathic concern. They did not report more distress. So rather than meaning sadness, these expressions may actually be markers of training-related growth and other-directed empathic concern, suggesting a qualitative change in the way participants engage with human suffering. This really is the fundamental point that I want to make. We are at time. So I could go on, but this was the fundamental empirical point I wanted to make that links our motivation with our data. I think Quinn will, in a flash talk, present more of our results. But I think overall what I've given you is a kind of set of thinking points to talk about. And I don't need to load you with more, because I'm happy to share offline. And we have another presentation from Tanya coming up that basically builds on this kind of platform with a whole other set of stories and studies. So I think since we're in 1 hour and 1 minute since we began, I will quit while I'm ahead. Thank you.